While everybody we know is distracted by noise, drama, and all of the misinformation we're getting everywhere these days, there are some underpinnings to the U.S. economy and its performance that we need to know about. Some of these are very, very good news. Some of them are a little bit frightening. Well, we're going to unpack all of this on today's episode of the Steve Beaman Show. Okay, well, welcome again to this show. We're all about empowering the community to get better and better in their understanding of what's going on in the world. We talk about everything here from politics, economics, finance, the digital nature of the future, and everything else. But today, as I said, I want to talk to you about some fundamental things in the economy. There are a lot of complexities, and there's a lot of stuff that people don't know. Quite frankly, if you listen to the evening news on any of the cable networks or the legacy media, you don't always hear the truth about things. And I want to talk about some things that are really, really good news today. And I spend my life researching and looking at these things. So I'm confident that what I'm going to tell you is the absolute gospel truth. And you can check me on it anytime you want. But one of the biggest things that we've seen since the inauguration of the new administration, and believe me, this is not a political statement. I'm not trying to talk politics, but I am going to talk policy and effect. Since the inauguration of Trump, we have seen private capital totaling about $3 trillion come into the United States economy or be promised to come in. That's a huge stimulus. If we go back and you look, for example, during the last 4 years of the Biden administration, they injected about $3 trillion in stimulus money into the U.S. The difference is that's government money. So they're taking from taxpayers or debt, and they're injecting that back in. It worked because it boosts the what I'll call the acceleration or the speed of the money through the economy. And that's stimulative in its own way. But go look at the result of that stimulus. I'm on the radio every week talking about the jobs reports that we get and everything else. And if you look at the jobs reports in 23 and 24, most of the jobs, and I'm talking 70% maybe, were government jobs. So every time we created 200,000 jobs this quarter. We'll unpack that, and 150,000 of them were government. Now, that's not necessarily bad. We know we need a government, and we're hearing lately of all the fraud and abuse that goes on, but there's some government employment that's not a bad thing. But 70% of our economic growth coming out of government jobs? No, I don't think that's what we want at all. This $3 trillion is private money. And it's coming as investment capital into the United States. And this is an enormous stimulus for our economy. And this will benefit you directly. And I'm going to show you how it does it. But let's look at some of these things. I've made some notes because these are very important details. Schneider Electric just announced a $700 million investment into the United States to build factories working on energy infrastructure with AI. Now, that's not a big one, but it's a $700 million. It's not small. And they expect that to generate well over 1,000 jobs just for Schneider Electric. That doesn't count the downstream jobs. If you've ever been to a factory and you walk in, you know that surrounding it are restaurants, coffee shops, convenience stores. Those are the downstream jobs. So if you're going to create 1,000 jobs directly off new manufacturing, that's going to have an enormous impact downstream. Look at Hyundai. This one is big, $21 billion in U.S. manufacturing and supply chain. That's enormous. And if you've looked at the success of Hyundai over time, they make a really wonderful product, but it's nice that it's bringing home that type of move. And if you look at it, they're doing it as a hedge against these tariffs that they're being told about. So we're going to talk about tariffs a little later too. But when you look at the effect of the tariffs right now, specifically, Hyundai's bringing $20 billion back to the U.S. You got to love that. And if you look at the jobs, and I'll talk to you about some metrics you can use to measure jobs in a little bit, you're going to find these are real numbers, and they're really, really important for you and me. Stargate, and this is by OpenAI and these guys, they're looking at $500 billion of new investment into the United States. I mean, I could go on and on. Johnson & Johnson, $55 billion. Again, another Hyundai, they're going to have another $20 billion investment into the U.S. This is building a new steel plant. I mean, these things are coming in as private sector investments. One of the nicest ones I read about was Taiwan Semiconductor. Now, this is big. You've heard a lot of talk about semiconductors. And it is important. Those are the core of everything we have. The phone you have, the computer you have, the car you drive, your home appliances, virtually everything uses semiconductors. Well, right now, and you can quote me on it, I think all of the semiconductors we use are made in Taiwan. Well, there's some geopolitical problems with that in that China wants to recapture Taiwan. You've heard about that. Maybe in another episode of the show, we'll unpack that and find out what the reality of it is. But we know that they want it. China's been very explicit about their desire to have one China. Now, that creates a strategic problem for the Western countries and the U.S. specifically, because if they're making all the chips and China goes in there and effectively takes it over, you think that's a friendly government giving us our chips? Not at all. And that's a risk we face. So for Taiwan Semiconductor to be coming into the United States, and the number, I wrote it down, I think it's $100 billion over the next 5 years. And that's a big one because it's going to give us the ability to make our own chips and semiconductors. So these are big numbers. Again, the aggregate we've brought in, and this is just in the last 2 months, about $300 billion. The Trump administration is making a bet. And their bet is that if they can make the U.S. economy business friendly enough and use these tariffs as a bludgeoning device to get companies to move back here, they're betting that the growth in the U.S. economy will far outweigh any of the cost of the tariffs. And let me give you some of the math on this. And this is critically important. For every $1 billion invested in private capital, that's a $1 billion, you get 5,000 to 10,000 direct jobs. So if you do the math, take that 1 billion at 5,000 jobs or 10,000 to make the math easy, run it up to 3 trillion, you're looking at 30 million new jobs in the U.S. economy over the next few years. I mean, think about that. We're happy with maybe creating 2 million a year, and most of those have been government. We're talking about 30 million private sector jobs, all of which create wealth because they manage scarcity. That's a significant number. When you hear people talk about the golden age, that's what they're coming down to. If it's successful and we get $3 trillion, as it looks like it's going to happen, and it's deployed properly, we're looking at somewhere around 30 million new manufacturing, service sector, and supporting jobs. These are healthy economic building jobs. So this is not Wall Street fluff, and it's certainly not government stimulus. I made the comment earlier, when we look back at the last couple of years, you're looking at the vast majority of jobs that were created were government jobs. Now, again, I'm not going to talk politically about it, but when the government creates a job, it doesn't create wealth. It detracts wealth from the economy. The way that works is you go out and earn $1. You send 30 cents to Washington for a program. Well, they skim off 20% of it and use 80% or 70% for the program itself. That program may be stimulative, but that money that's stripped off for the bureaucracy is like paying, a good example would be a lawyer or an accountant. They're not necessarily productive. It's a cost and you have to have it. It's necessary, but it doesn't mean it's adding to the capital productivity going out forward. And so when we look at this again, we're talking about a $3 trillion private sector capitalization versus government with the creation of 30 to 35 million private sector jobs. That's an enormous wealth multiplier, just enormous. And we'll look, this is all on the good stuff. But if we look at this as let's call it the reindustrialization of the United States, massively powerful and enormously important for everybody to understand. This is why Trump's making the bets he's making. If, again, through using tariffs as a bludgeoning tool, he can motivate companies to come back here and produce their products, as we're seeing, well, that's going to be really, really good for the middle class and the people who want to go into the middle class. It's a super, super win-win strategy if it works. And as I've said on radio, the jury's still out. We don't know if it will work at these levels, but it certainly looks like a promising beginning. So as you go through your day, when we're looking at $3 trillion of new capital, you can feel very good about it from the standpoint of an optimism of what's going to be coming down the pike. How soon will it hit and how soon will we see it? I think that's going to depend where the money comes in and what it's for. If you look at the advanced manufacturing stuff, that takes a while to build it. There's no question about it. But we need this stuff because we need to reintroduce that manufacturing base to the United States. So the good news today that I brought up and the good news that I want you to know, $3 trillion of brand new capital. That's exciting. And when you tie that down to 1,000 jobs for every $1 billion, you're looking at 30 million new jobs in the United States. How can you not say that's not the golden era? Now, I know on the other side, people are going to say, well, what would cause this to go wrong? A lot of things. If you look and say, all of a sudden, these tariffs don't work and they blow up. And I want to give you some numbers later on tariffs and just talk about it in more detail. But if you look at tariffs not working and people just rescind back to their own countries, and you get the European countries, the Asian countries, the BRICS countries really turning on the U.S., well, you could have a problem with that because the tariffs won't work. But I go back to what's really happening. We have $3 trillion already committed. So it looks like prima facie that the tariffs are working. I'm a free trader. I believe that in the longest term sense, we want to have completely free trade between us and Canada. No question. Drop all the trade barriers. But in the interim, we need fair trade, and we need to start re-incentivizing companies like Hyundai to come back to the United States so that we can start getting some of that job growth. I think that's just really, really exciting. And when you look again at trade, and we look at these tariffs, and I talk to folks a lot about it because the tariffs that Trump's proposing look bad in the media. And as I said at the beginning, we're all subject to drama and hype and misinformation. The reality of the tariffs is, first of all, we're not doing this from nowhere. These other countries tariff us hugely, and you've heard a lot about that, whether we can't sell rice into Japan or sell other products into Europe. Certainly China, they steal our tech when we have to go in there. But if you look, and I think I have some data down here, I mean, if you look at the European Union and their tariffs on our steel, it's staggering. So the tariffs are retaliatory only in the sense that we're finally stepping up saying enough is enough. We have not been treated fairly. And I'll go back, look at our entire trade program. And if you look at global trade and how it evolved, go post-World War II. So I'm not old enough to remember World War II. I was born in the early 60s, but I certainly have read my share of history about it, and I talked to enough people who did live through it. But I will tell you, we came out of World War II, and the United States was far and away the number one country on the planet. I don't care what metric you look at, whether it was steel production, auto production, rubber production, food production, media production, anything. The United States was way, way ahead of everybody else. But at the same time, we had this enormously powerful economy, but we were trying to rebuild Europe, and we were trying to rebuild Japan. Now, we were doing that for selfish reasons. We wanted to build customers, and we wanted to build stable countries over there. But as importantly, we wanted to keep them from falling into the hands of the Soviet communist bloc. So our trade policies evolved around a world where the U.S. was massively wealthy, much more wealthy than anybody else, and therefore we could actually give them our wealth every year through trade and help build their economies while it didn't really hurt us that bad. Well, roll that clock forward 50 years, 70 years now, 80 years. The concern now is the U.S. is no longer the wealthiest player on the block. And that's just a fact. Yes, we have the biggest economy. We have about a $29 trillion GDP. We're the biggest. China's number 2, which, by the way, go look someday at how fast they came up. They were nothing. By 1980, they weren't even in the top 10. They've come way back, way fast. But so we've got, this big economy, But is it really a productive economy anymore? If you look at our labor participation rates, which are at all-time lows, we have 70% of the people working in this country. But there are some other statistics that go to that. And this is why I hope that you and I can develop a community of people who want to talk about this stuff and learn about it. It's real important for you, the future of certainly my kids and grandkids, but you and yours too. If you look at growth in the U.S. post 2008, and when I heard this statistic a while back, it floored me. And I'd never looked at it. But as I looked at it, I thought, my gosh, in 2008, let's say from 2008 to 2025, our economy has grown about $14-15 trillion. Now, that's pretty good. You say, well, wow, you're growing rapidly. During that same period, our debt has grown something like $24 trillion. Now, think about that. So our economy has grown, but our debt has grown much faster. And that's just government debt. That doesn't count consumer debt, all the other personal debts we have. So what that's telling you is since 2008 or 10 in that area, we haven't had any real economic growth. None. Zero. That's frightening. So that's when I say we're looking at this transition into a reindustrialization of the economy, and that's exciting. Look where we're coming from on that. It's really terrifying when you think the U.S. hasn't had any net economic growth in the last 15 years. The growth has come from borrowing money. It's like living on your credit card saying, I live well. Well, eventually that game comes to an end. Now, in national governments, it's a little harder for it to come to an end because we can print our own money and all that. But inflation and everything else is the result. And until we get back to growing the underlying economy, we're going to have a real stagnant situation. And that's just the way it is. So I go back that, at the beginning, I said there's good news and then there's scary news. The good news is we're starting to see proof that the reindustrialization of the economy is going to happen. Very excited about that. On the downside, it better happen because we need real economic growth. I was looking recently, you know what? This is another funny statistic that ties to all this, which is what we need to be aware of. If you look at the debt and the government debt per citizen, so this is for all 300 and whatever million of us, it's about $107,000 a person. Now, normalize that for taxpayers. In other words, what's the debt on the people who actually pay taxes? It's over $350,000. Now, there's several things to that, right? Number one, there's a massive discrepancy between those who pay tax and those who don't. In the United States today, I think the number is roughly 50% of the people pay no income tax. So half the people are paying all of it. The top 10% pay, 90% or something like that. But the bottom line is that when you have this kind of debt burden on people, you go look at your own books. Where are you going to come up with $320,000? And that's just federal, by the way. That doesn't count state. You throw states on top of this, it's more like $360,000 each, especially if you come out of Illinois where I do. But the point is, these are scary numbers. We have to fix this. I was talking to somebody recently, and they were saying that, this last election had the choice between, good and bad or bad and good or bad and bad. I don't care how you look at it. But I was telling them that in my mind, it's a choice between surviving or not. And here's why I say that. It's not that I'm big pro-Trump. It's not that I was big anti-Kamala. I'm just not like that. It's the reality of our situation. We're in a position now where we're not only $36 trillion in debt, but we're $2 to $3 trillion a year in deficit. In other words, we're overspending by $2 to $3 trillion a year. And look where that money's going. I talk to people all the time and they say, well, let's cut defense spending. Okay, there's a real problem here. Defense is like fourth on the list of spending. The number one expenditure in the country is Medicare. That's going to the people over 65 who get medical care. It's a wonderful program. We all love it, but it's a hugely expensive program because people are living much longer than they used to. Go back when Social Security was formed, they set the retirement age at 65. You know what the life expectancy of a person was then? 65. Now, we've still kept that retirement age at 65, but the life expectancy is almost 90. So we have this huge gap. And as a result of that, Medicare has become the biggest budget item that we have, followed by Medicaid, which is the state program for the uninsurable, and Social Security. Those three things, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, are the biggest drivers of that $2 trillion deficit. You say, well, certainly military's next. Nope. The next biggest, and this is really frightening to me, is interest on the debt. We're spending more money on interest on our debt than we spend on the military. Now, there's an interesting factoid about that. Never in history, never, as far as we can go back and look at recorded history of governments and militaries, not once has a country been able to sustain itself when it spent more money on interest payments than it did on the military. That's a scary number. So you look at this and say, well, we've got Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. Then we have defense. Now, we do spend a lot on defense. I think we're bigger spending than the next 10 countries combined. So, yeah, we have a big defense budget because we've been the protector of the world. It's our Navy that keeps shipping lines open around the world. It's our armies that keep despots from taking over everywhere they want. I mean, look what Ukraine has cost us. We've spent, $100 billion over there. So we have this economic situation, though, where these entitlements of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and then thrown on our interest, are creating multi-trillion-dollar deficits, which just pile onto that debt every year. So when I go back to what I was saying, when I looked at this election and I looked at what could happen, my fear is it was more of the same. And more of the same is Republican or Democrat. Either way, I don't really care. So here's the situation with that. If we kept doing it, we're going to get more deficits, more debt, and inflation inevitably will take off. Inevitably. The other concern is the Federal Reserve, which mandates and monitors our interest rates, has kept interest rates much, much lower than they should naturally be. Well, if those interest rates go up, guess what else goes up? Payments on interest on the debt. So these are dangerous things. So I looked at that and said, you can't do same old, same old. There's no way, it won't work. This time around, we have to shake it up. We have to do something vastly different. And that's why I support the attempts being made in Washington right now to shake it up. I think we have to. I think our futures matter. And inflation is a real thing. If we have to start printing money in order to pay for our debts, which we can do, we'll never default on the debt. We'll just print more money. But that makes your money less valuable and makes prices go up. And especially, this is why it's all tied together. Prices go up especially on what? Imported goods. And that ties into another frightening statistic. I don't know if you knew this or not, but in the CIA, they keep books on trade deficits and balance of payments and all that stuff. There are 207 countries in the United States. 207. Okay. If you look at what's called balance of payments or trade deficits, basically, how much do you buy from the world versus how much you sell to the world? Well, the best off country in the world is China. They sell much more to the world than they buy from the world. That's partly because of their own restrictive trade practices, but it's also partly because they're cheaper producers of things. So go down that list. Where do you think the U.S. is? Is it number 10? Well, no. Number 50? No. Number 100? No. It's number 207. In other words, we have the biggest trade deficit in the world. So we're right now buying about $1 trillion more from the world around us than we're selling to the world around us. So what that means is we're transferring $1 trillion of our wealth every year to the rest of the world. The biggest player there is China. We have about a $200 billion trade deficit with China. So we're giving China $200 billion a year. Now, I don't know about you, but that's frightening to me. We're not that wealthy anymore. Where are we getting all this money to spend overseas? Oh, wait, we're borrowing it. Well, that's not sustainable. Not at all. So that's why I get concerned when people say, well, let's just keep doing what we're doing. I mean, there's a woman named Teresa Ghilarducci at the New School of Economics. And this goes back about 15 years ago. I got in a debate on a program with her, and they were talking about how government debt doesn't matter. You can borrow as much as you want. It's the velocity of money through the system that matters. I get that to a point. But at some point when your debt's not worth anything anymore because you're so in debt that you can't pay your bills without printing money, that's just a recipe for miserably high interest rates, miserably high inflation, and a lifestyle degradation to the United States that I don't want to have. So especially if you're in your 20s and you're wondering how things got so expensive in the last 4 years, government spent $3 trillion. When government spends, it has to get the money somewhere. It gets it out of taxes, it gets it from borrowing it, or it prints it. And in the last 15 years, we've printed an awful lot of money. So you're seeing this as an effect. And that's what, when I looked at it and said, we have to have a change, we have to have something to mitigate this. And so when I see the current administration saying, we're going to shake things up, we're going to work to reduce the size of government. I say, oh, by the way, let me touch about that. There's a lot of grief coming to the Musk-Trump thing about how many people they fired. You know, they haven't even touched the scale compared to the people that Obama fired or Clinton fired or any of these prior politicians in their, shrinking government models. We haven't shrunk the government that much. What we've stopped is fraudulent use of the money. And that's to the tune of about $50 billion, I think, so far. But the point of that, unless we shake something up, the future we have for ourselves and our kids and our grandkids, and again, if you're in your 20s and you're saying, I don't feel like I can live that, like my parents did, I don't feel like I can buy a house, I don't feel like I can exist. Well, you're seeing the result of 70% of the jobs being government jobs. There is no growth in the private economy. That's a bottom line thing. And we've got this problem where not only are we not growing, but we're shipping $1 trillion of our money overseas every year. So again, to put it down in English, you're trying to get a job. You don't really have jobs, so you're living on your credit card, but you're still giving away, a bunch of your money. It doesn't make sense. And this didn't make sense either. So I'm glad to see a shakeup. I think the jury is out on whether it will work. I think it looks good on paper, but we'll see if we can actually come through with it and make it happen. I think all of this then, you look at the risks. Why won't it happen and how does it, get affected? I think one of the concerns we have to look at is the transition that we're experiencing into the digital economy. And this is undoubtedly going to play into this going forward. You have to be conscious of it. I do a lot of work in technology. In fact, I just wrote a book on the meta world in business. It's important for us to understand this because the integrated world of AI, robotics, machine learning, and all that stuff is going to affect the underlying business community. And you're not dumb. You get it like I do. If you can build a factory and it's all robots, why would you hire people? You wouldn't. You'd hire the robots. That's exactly the economy we're heading for. Now, I don't know where that leads us. I don't know what it means when we don't need people to produce products. I don't know. But that's years down the road to be concerned about. In the near term, the ability to add 30 million jobs to our economy, building and supporting the technologies that build those factories, I'm all for it. I hope we can do it because we need them. In the next years, we're going to see truck drivers out of work. We're going to see those kind of base industries transition because technology takes over their job. They will transition into these new industries. And thankfully, we're getting the private capital in here to drive that. So as we head into a digital age, all of this comes to play for your benefit, but I'm sure glad you joined me on this episode, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the show. And again, we're going to talk about those 5 paths to a transformed life. I'm Steve Beaman, and it's my pleasure to spend this time with you each and every time we can.